Hello, my name is Charlimbos. I go by Bob. I'm not your typical painter, and today is my last video of my homeless dog painting. The biggest focal point is the face and touch-ups, and a lot of little things that will increase the impact of the painting. Also, there's some previous videos that led up to this. Check them out if you haven't already. When finishing a painting, you have to look at it very carefully and decide what needs the most work. And in my opinion, the face was definitely something that needed some touch-ups for sure. Everything from little hairs to different colors and creating some better division among the hairs was necessary to give the dog some life. Obviously the eyes are probably the most important thing on the face, so I did spend some time trying to give you a sense that if you looked at the dog, it might glance right back at you. But since the dog's face was in the shade, there was not much detail to capture, but I did pay attention to the eyelids and the eyebrows of the dog, plus the pupils. For this dog, his eyes were more in the reddish color, and in ways that gave the dog a more sadder appearance. The nose also needed a lot of work as well. He seemed to have hairs that were a little on the darker side above his nose, so I went back into them and made him a little more on the distinct side. And among those dark hairs, there were light ones that I had to blend in. Because his face had a lot of different types of patches of color throughout, and that gave him the distinct look of his identity that I wanted to capture. When painting Whiskers, you have to have a very steady hand and try to use a very fine brush as well, and mix your paint with a medium that will make it smooth, so when you apply it you could do nice thin lines. But anyway, in this scenario I just laid out where the whiskers would be, and later on I will go and finish them off more towards the end of the painting. Besides the face, the ear also needed some work, particularly the one on the left. Some of the things I did to enhance it was separate it from the rest of the body by outlining the highlights and also darkening some areas so they stood out. Plus the ear was not actually a solid white. There's actually some patches of black, and then also I refined some of the hairs so they stood out. Besides the ear, I also enhanced the hairs between the left arm and head as well. There was more contrast needed even though it was in the light. Because of that, they actually cast a shadow, and you have to try to capture the darkness of those hairs. And then add highlights too, and dry brush when necessary to smooth things out. One of the things I feel that I failed to capture is making the dog appear very 3D. So I went back and emphasized some of the lights and darks and exaggerated them a little bit, particularly the left arm and the face and some of the areas where the light and dark meet. I wanted to give the presence that the sun is beating down on the dog's body as well, and the casted shadows from the folds. When I looked at the painting very carefully, I felt those were weak points, so I went darker and lighter where it was necessary. I wanted the fingernails of the dog to stand out, so I went back into them and added some highlights and increased the contrast so they stood out a little more. Plus the yellow part of the sidewalk needed a little more detail. It's very close to the viewing plane, and I knew I already added quite a bit of detail, but I felt more would actually make it better, but also the right kind of detail, such as increasing the contrast of all the bumps and crevices. I also felt some of the shadows were not dark enough, so I went back into them, particularly on the right side of the dog. Besides that, I also tried to capture some of the detail that I might have missed. Like the paint chip, a few more cracks and bumps and other imperfections. As stated before, one of the reasons why I emphasize the imperfections is because of the realism of the issue. If you notice from my previous videos, I actually laid out the grass early on, but I didn't finalize them because I knew I had to work on the concrete. And now that I finished the concrete, I am finishing the grass with a few tones of light greens and dark greens. It was sad to see a dog just laying out in the sun suffering, and by capturing the realism of all the imperfections, I believe it added to the painting. So I focused on trying to make them believable and sculpt them with the paint with light and dark. So I went back into them, especially in the foreground, to make them even more detailed and pop out. Everything from little hairline cracks on the paint to the light and dark of the bumps, reflective light, paint chips, and boosted the contrast in certain areas, especially where the light and dark meet. And then there's the plant. I didn't forget about it. It didn't need much more work. I just needed to highlight some of the leaves and darken certain sections so they popped out more. Always liked the placement of it and how it's just underneath the dog's nose. It's almost like it was meant to be in the photo. And then even though the paint is covering the bricks that form the sidewalk, I had to paint in a way where you could see the distinction where they are and the division between them. If there's something I'm going to remember the most from this painting is the amount of effort I put into the yellow concrete, both the light and the dark, but mostly on the darker side where it's in the shade. There are so many variations of imperfections that I tried to paint and depict. Plus there's even like black markings from tires or shoes. It might seem like a very time consuming thing to do, but my goal was to add to the realism of the location where the dog is and the realism of abandoned animals like this dog who has seen better days. Towards the end, I started focusing again on the body of the dog. I was not too satisfied with the hair, and it had to do with giving it more of a sculpted look. So I went back and started looking into the darks and the lights and tried to also capture the division between the hairs so some stood out. It required laying out lines of color, light and darks, and then in some scenarios I would blur them with a dry brush, especially towards the back of the dog so the front of the dog stood out more. What helped is also using very thick lights, such as titanium white with a tad of cadmium orange or cadmium yellow, or a little bit of both, and being very thick about the application of the paint, because that will make the texture physical, so the lines of the hair will stand out even more, especially when the painting is hanged on a wall. Even in a white dog, there's a lot of different colors, and if you look at the close-up of this face, there's little hints of brown, black, gray, white, orange, and I try to capture each of those colors, but in a very subtle way since overall the coat is white. Most of the dog's head was actually in the shade, but there were parts of it that were in the light, so I had to go back to make sure the highlights stood out, and I exaggerated a little bit to give it more of a sculpted look, but the important thing is I wanted the presence of the sun visible. Towards the beginning, I mentioned how I laid out where the whiskers go, and now I am actually painting them. It does require a very steady hand, and you'll notice I made mistakes a few times. And what do? Well, I use a towel to erase them, then apply them again. This is a lot easier to do when the paint is dry in the area, but if it's wet, that's a different story. In other words, when the paint is dry, that's probably the best opportunity to do the whiskers. Unless you want the whiskers to be on the blurry side, then wet on wet would be the better option. But in my scenario, I wanted them to be sharp. Again, the body of the dog required a lot of line work, and here you can see I'm applying some darks in between the light hairs. All the work I put into the hair, I don't think it amounted to nothing. If anything, it added to the whole painting. Everything from all the variations of colors to textures and light and dark contrast that would make certain hairs stand out, and then certain ones that would recede. It gave me the look I was going for. And to finish off the painting, I added more little highlights and darks in the concrete tiles. Why? Well, it is very close in the foreground, and in order to create the illusion of depth, I'm using detail in the front to establish it. And to do this, it wasn't really that hard. It was just very tedious and time consuming to use a little paintbrush to paint dots of light and dark and then smooth them out. But it wasn't just random ones. I did look at the photo a little bit to see if I could capture certain particular ones that stood out. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. And if you've been following this series of 4 videos, thanks for your commitment. I have thoughts on my next painting. When I was in Greece, after I did a dog painting, I followed up with a cat one. So stay tuned for more. Also, check out my Instagrams, Not Your Typical Painter, and also Not Your Typical Photos. Once again, My name is Charles Rarlambos. I go by Bob. I am not your typical painter.